I want to talk about Niger. And I want to talk about the fact that, you know, I said that military intervention, I predicted that it was not likely. Because Nigeria, they said they were going to put the military option on the table, but then when the deadline for the junta stepping down in Mali, not in Mali, but in Niger came, they didn't. And then their reaction to it was very milquetoast. They didn't use extremely strong language to say that they were going to intervene militarily. There's a lot of opposition internally in Nigeria, which is the primary state that has been leading the intervention effort. The Senate objected. Different civic groups objected to the intervention, and I'm still not sold that it's going to happen. I still don't think I'm sold on the fact that they've dealt with all of the internal criticism to the point where I know for sure they're going to go through with it. And I still think there's a possibility that this doesn't happen, especially since they put it off another week to give the junta another 5 days to try to step down. But the Nigerian government and ECOWAS, after a meeting Thursday, which I said was going to be a deciding factor, it was going to be the day that we really find out if they're going through with it or not, they have redoubled their efforts and declared that if the junta does not step down in the next week, they will militarily intervene. So after some waffling in the middle, the Nigerian presidency is trying to plow ahead with possible military intervention. Let's see. Do we got any good reports on this? Let's go with Reuters.
West African nations on Friday worked on plans for a possible military intervention in Niger. The regional bloc also pledged to enforce sanctions, travel bans and asset freezes on the junta, which ousted former President Mohamed Bazoum on July 26.
So far, they've already stopped trade from traveling through Nigeria. They've already stopped 70% of Niger's electricity flow, which comes from Nigeria. I mean, there are convoys of aid at the border of Niger right there, just at the border, just waiting because they cannot transport goods across the border. Aid groups are already pulling out. Aid for both not only Niger, but Mali and Burkina Faso is getting cut. A lot of NGOs are pulling out their staff due to the threat of possible military intervention or due to the coup and them not wanting to work with the government. I mean, there's already so much economic problems that people in Niger are facing. And considering how much of the population is reliant on aid, which is now being cut, and the power outages that are happening, and the service cuts, I don't know how much more pressure Nigeria can place. But since Nigeria is where the majority of goods travel to and from Niger from, unless they can quickly revamp through Algeria and try to find another route, which they're just not going to be able to develop very quickly. No matter what happens, Nigeria is headed into some rocky economic waters.
6. After a summit of its heads of state, ECOWAS ordered the activation of a standby force for possible use against the junta. It said it had not given up hope of a peaceful resolution to the crisis, but that all options, including military action, were possible. Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu.
And you will see from the communique of this extraordinary summit that no option is taken off the table, including the use of force as a last resort.
It is not clear how big the force would be, if it would actually invade, and which countries would contribute. Security analysts said ECOWAS force could take weeks or longer to assemble, potentially leaving room for negotiations. The junta has said it would defend the country against any foreign attack. Director of Strategic Stabilization Advisors, Annalise Bernard, spoke to Reuters from California.
So there's still a lot of unknowns, but this is a significant next step and certainly an escalation of tensions, at least between the regional bloc and the junta bloc that seems to be forming right now.
The junta
between
bloc.
Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger specifically.
In the capital, Niamey, residents condemned the military intervention plan.
This is an act of aggression, and we call on the legitimate authorities, the members of the CNSP, to consider it an act of war, an act of aggression, and to respond with force.
ECOWAS needs to understand what the people of the various member countries expect of it. What is expected of ECOWAS is to attack the causes of coup d'etat, not the consequences.
The European...
That's an interesting sentiment. So it's just deal with the poverty and deal with the economic deprivation, but also like it's also an issue of democratic maturity, which is something that will only evolve once it is shown that coups cannot work. But whatever. Well, let's finish this and I'll give my thoughts.
The Union and the United States reiterated concern about the conditions under which Bazoum and his family were being detained. Uranium-rich Niger is a key ally for the West in the fight against Islamist militants in the Sahel region. Until the coup, it was also aligned with the West after neighboring Mali, and others turned against former colonial power France in favor of closer ties with Russia. France said late on Thursday it fully backed all the conclusions of ECOWAS meeting, but it stayed clear of outlining any concrete support it could give to any potential intervention.
So I will say, if there is a military intervention, American and French troops on the ground would probably not be the best optically, and I don't think, at least the United States, I'm not as familiar with France, at least the United States is probably not going to want to contribute soldiers, ground troops, to such an operation. The United States wants to be almost singularly focused on countering terrorism in the region, and it would be better for everyone involved, if there is going to be a military intervention, that it's solved by regional players who could have some long-term investment. And this is the big thing I want to talk about, because I was of the belief last time we talked about this that there isn't going to be any intervention. I thought the Nigerian presidency was waffling. I thought ECOWAS was waffling. It looked like they were going to back off. And now that seems to have 180. Now, that doesn't mean that the intervention is going to happen. Maybe there is going to be some back down from the junta. Doubtful. Or maybe Nigeria will still back down. Maybe ECOWAS will still waffle. But as of right now, if nothing changes, then ECOWAS has now committed for the second time to using military force if they do not back down. So there's a few things I want to talk about here, about the consequences of a potential military intervention, and a few things that we need to talk about. The first thing that we need to talk about, and this is a given, after they go in and they overthrow the junta, assuming that they can pull it off, because, you know, combined Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso's military power, it still doesn't match up to Nigeria's, and they're not the only party participating. So it should be possible, but it would be difficult. Not only because, you know, it's going to depend on how stable and how well the junta performs militarily. Definitely after all the years of Western investment into the junta, and if it stays loyal to the new military government. That's not the only reason. But there's also questions about terror groups, because the terror groups, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram in Nigeria, these groups are going to take advantage of the instability. And we have reason to believe that they are already taking advantage of the instability. So it's not just going to be fighting the Niger junta. It's also going to be fighting these terror groups and having to stabilize the country afterwards, which means long-term troop deployments. The same long-term troop deployments that many people in Niger view as almost like an occupation. Not all of them, but a decent fraction of them do. And that's another question. Not only is Nigeria and ECOWAS willing to have long-term troop deployments to stabilize the region, especially if they have to disassemble and reassemble the military, who knows how they're going to reconstruct the country. But are they also willing to sustain it on a humanitarian level with aid and food for the people, and develop it so that it can sustain itself on its own? Because, you know, you can't just beat the terrorists into submission. It's not, if you don't have a a cohesive government, stable country, safety, and economic security and economic opportunity, people are going to go join these groups. People are going to go join these organizations. I'm not saying that's the only factor. Ideology plays a part. But if somebody is economically destitute, it's much easier to radicalize them or make them think that they don't have many other options. So are they going to be willing to make that investment? Are they going to make that investment? Or is this going to be a situation where they just walk in, put in Mohammed Bazoum, and then walk out? Now, that's beside the fact that there are rumors going around that Mohammed Bazoum's life is actually forfeit, that he's not getting water, he's not really getting a lot of food or really much food at all, he doesn't have electricity, he's being treated like garbage, and that there's a rumor that the military junta actually threatened to murder Bazoum if there is an intervention in the country, and that this threat was made to Victoria Nuland. If they're going to intervene, this is a long-term commitment. Because if they just go in, overthrow the military junta, bust up the military, put in Bazoum, and leave, I mean, you couldn't make a better situation for the terrorists. You couldn't make a better situation for Al-Qaeda. You couldn't make a better situation for ISIS. That means the military's going to be weak because they just went through a war, and Bazoum's going to be weak because he was just challenged by the military. So if they're going to invade, they're going to have to be there for a while to stabilize the country and make these investments to set it back on the right course. And I don't know if Nigeria is willing to do that. I don't know if ECOWAS is willing to do that. Nigeria has its own economic problems. Nigeria got opposition domestically to this intervention. Not everybody's like, yeah, hey, woohoo, let's go in. And let's say it's 3 to 4 years into it, and it still is going to require another few years to, stabilize things and get everything properly invested. And the Nigerian population's like, I don't want to cover this. I don't want to pay for this. Many of them don't want to pay for it now. Many of them don't want to intervene now. If they're not willing to make the long-term investment, then there is no reason to intervene. Because then what you could end up doing is replacing one group of tyrants with another group of Islamist tyrants who would take advantage of the situation. I mean, when it comes to Niger, the last thing I want to touch on is public support. Now, I need to emphasize before anything that we do not know exactly who the majority of people in Niger support in the government. We don't know that. And the reason we don't know that is that there's no polling data on it. And the elections, the last election we had, ousted Mohammed Bazoum. And we don't know how people's perception of Mohammed Bazoum changed over the last 2 years of him being in a position of power. If, as many news outlets are reporting, the majority of the public is against an ECOWAS intervention, it's only going to make occupation that much more difficult. And it's only going to discourage the people engaged in it more. If the locals hate you, that's something that doesn't help morale. And it also doesn't help you establish a stable country. The last thing we would want is for them to think about the government that was placed in after the junta is ousted to be propped up by foreign occupiers. Because we all saw what happened in Afghanistan when that was the perception. Obviously, Afghanistan and Niger has different politics, different situations. But it isn't difficult to see how we could set up a government, leave, and then the government collapses because it has no legitimacy in the eyes of the people, even if Mohammed Bazoum was democratically elected. Public sentiment can change. Public sentiment can change very quickly. In 2012, Yanukovych was elected to be president of Ukraine. 2 years later, that dude fled the country because of the firestorm of hate he produced against himself. Anyway, point is, I'm very wary about ECOWAS intervention. I'm worried because it is not clear that they have support of the domestic people. I'm worried of the intervention because I'm not clear about Nigeria or ECOWAS's commitment to a long-term occupation. And I'm concerned because of what it could mean for destabilization. And even though the coup in and of itself was a destabilizing factor that terrorists are taking advantage of, if a proper stabilization is not done afterwards, when they reinstall Mohamed Bazoum's government, assuming he is not murdered by the junta, I am concerned that it could create an environment for terrorism to sprout up and fill power vacuums. And even if they don't take over the country, the trend of terrorism activity in Niger has been going down. And I have a fear that it's going to start spiking up again. Anyway, I have a lot of concerns about a ECOWAS intervention in Niger. I don't like the military junta. I believe that it is unbelievably corrupt. It is anti-democratic. It didn't care about the wishes of the people. It just did something that 7 months ago they claimed wasn't necessary, because many of the coup leaders were saying 7 months ago, or in speeches, that they had been properly dealing with the terroristic threat and that the amount of terroristic incidents had been decreasing. In comparison to Mali and Burkina Faso, their neighbors, which are ruled by military juntas, which have been dealing with the terroristic threat not so well. Part of the reason why Mali and Burkina Faso coming to Niger's aid is kind of difficult. Anyway, I wanted to give you guys an update as intervention is looming closer than ever.